By now, we got a pretty good understanding about how Vue helps us with animating things. There's one specific kind of thing which you might want to navigate, which we haven't seen thus far though, and that would be changes between two routes. For that, I'll quickly add routing here, simply by adding a new pages folder, and then in here we could have all users page, let's say, and also a course goals page. I will not really populate those components with live or with real values. I just want to dive into how we can animate between these pages. For that here, I'll simply add a div with a class of container in the template of all users and add a h2 tag where I say all users. And I'll then copy that and add the same here to course goals. But of course here I will say course goals so that we can tell these two pages apart. So these are very simple dummy components which just have templates. Now we can quit the development server with Ctrl+C and npm install -- save the Vue router. This package which we already installed in the routing module. Once it is installed, we can restart the development server and then add routing as you learned it in the routing module. So here in main.js or in a separate router.js file, but since we'll only have two routes, I'll go with main.js. You can import create router from Vue router and also already import create web history and then set up the router here. So here we have the router. We create it with create router and pass a config object to create router, set the history to the result of create web history, and then add our routes. And I want to have two routes here. The first route should be applied if we have /nothing. In this case, I want to load the all users component. Therefore, we should import it. All users from /pages all users.vue. And we can also already import course goals from /pages course goals.vue. And then load all users here on this first route. And then add a second route with a path of /goals, let's say, where we want to load the course goals component. So these are the two routes I have here. Now we can call app use to register this router with our Vue app. And with that, Vue is aware of these routes. Now, as you learned it, in order to load a route and to display it, we need to go to our app Vue file. And in there, I will actually remove all the content we had in there and just add router Vue so that we just switch between these two components based on which route we selected. In order to move back and forth between these components from inside the running app, I will actually also go to all users and add a router link to my course goals. So therefore the two prop points at /goals, because that was the path I'm handling here. And I will copy that, and in course goals, I'll add the same link, but I'll go to just / here, which therefore goes to all users. If we save that, I got some complaints here that I'm not using the users list component anymore in app Vue. And that's correct, I'm registering it here, but I'm not doing anything with it in my template. So we can comment this out and remove this import, or remove the components option entirely here. And now with that saved, we see all users, and we can switch between those routes. That's all nice, but it has nothing to do with animations. Well, I want to animate the transition between these two routes. And thankfully, we can do this. Now, one thought you could have is that you wrap your router Vue with transition. I mean, it's a regular component, and if we want to animate with Vue's help between two components, like the button we saw earlier, Then we wrapped the element with transition, right? That's what we did previously in this course when we wanted to animate components. And we could then define some new CSS classes here. Route enter from, route enter active, and route enter to. And I want to use an animation, so I will actually only use route enter active and use my slide scale animation, the keyframes which are set here, over 0.4 seconds and with a ease function or ease out, let's say. And then also define route leave active. Of course, depending on which animation you want to build, you could also add route leave from and route leave to. But here I again just want to apply an animation, and that will be slide scale over the same duration with ease in. And now, since I named these CSS classes like this with route, we could apply this name to this transition. Like that. But since I always say could and so on, this probably is not how it's going to work. And indeed, we do have some strange behavior here, but we actually see that router view can no longer be used directly inside of transition. Now, it says no longer because previously with older versions of Vue, that did work. So maybe if you learned that, you're still used to this old way of doing it. With Vue 3, this is no longer possible. And we actually get the solution here in the warning as well. We need to restructure our code. Transition now needs to go inside of our router view. So we should move transition inside there. But this alone now also won't do it, because while router view supports getting content that will be rendered inside of it, now we also need to tell it where to actually render the actual page, the actual component that should be rendered based on the route that is active. And for that, we can use the scoped slot syntax router view uses under the hood. Normally, we don't need it, but for transitions with routes, you do need it. You can use this vslot directive, which I introduced earlier in the course when we talked about slots, to extract the slot props you're getting here. You get those by the router view component, which is built in. And you can then use the dynamic component to bind it to slot props dot component. So slot props have a property named component with a capital C, which holds the component that should be loaded for the currently selected route. And this strange looking syntax is what you need to animate switches between these components. If you now save this, you no longer get the warning. And now this kind of works, but of course this looks really stupid here, right? I mean, it's just moving around and we got two components on the page at the same time. So this is not fully what we want. But technically this is correct at least. But one thing we want to change here is something we already saw earlier when we switched between two buttons. We want to make sure that only one component is shown on the page at the same time. And you might remember that we can achieve this by adding the mode prop to the transition component. And there we had out in and in out. And if we use out in, we ensure that first the leaving component is animated before then the entering component is animated. So with that, if I reload, now this leaves and then we have the new component. I will admit it still looks strange, but that's just because of the animation CSS code we set up. If we use a different animation, like the fade button classes we have here, if I use this as a name here, fade button, this will look nicer. With that, we got a nice fade animation between these routes. So that is how you can animate route transitions. Now, one thing you might have noticed before is that when you used that other animation, which looked a bit strange, the route animation here, We even saw that animation when we loaded the page for the first time. So you have this initial animation. The reason for that is that with the view router, technically the first active route is an empty route. And then when your page starts, when your page is loaded for the first time, it immediately switches to the route that should be used for the given path in your URL. That means that technically when the app starts, the view router goes from no route to the chosen route for the given path. And hence it plays an animation because we go from one component, nothing, to the to be loaded component. To avoid this behavior, you can go to main.js where you register the router, and there you can actually use the router to call the isReady method on it. This method will let you know when the router successfully evaluated which page should be loaded. This gives you a promise, and hence you can call then on it. And in the function you pass to this then block, in this function, the router will now not go from the empty to the to be selected page, but instead at this point of time it is aware of the page that should be loaded, and it will therefore not make this initial transition. So you can then mount your app inside of this function to only mount and therefore render your app once the router is fully set up and aware of the page that should be loaded. And if you do that and reload, you don't have this initial animation. Now you just have it if you switch routes. And now I'm going back to the other animation since that looked nicer. So to the fade button animation here. But that is it. That is how you can animate the transition between different routes. It's a strange looking syntax maybe, but you really only need it for this transition scenario. But with that, you're now able to also animate changes between different pages.